Screencast 45, a preview of Dynamics AX 2012 Report Programming Model. What is the report programming model? If you've remembered my previous screencasts, when we try to build a new report, we'll bind a report to a query. Or we'll create a C# data method that creates a data table. And let's think about that C# data method for a second. Let me create a new report. And I'll add a report here. And when you add a data set here, I said let's think about a C# data method. What does it do? It creates a system.data.data table. It defines the schema for that table by adding columns. And the columns have a name and a type. And then it populates the rows of that table with data. And this all happens at runtime. It's a very dynamic system. In AX 2009, in order to use any code to manipulate or generate data, you essentially had to use this C# data method technique. But it wasn't a great technique when your code, your business logic, was in, of course, X++ code. So we introduced something in AX 2012 called the report programming model. It is a code-based way of creating and manipulating reports. And the first piece, the major piece of this programming model, is a concept called report data provider. Let's take a look here in datasets in this report, and let's try to add a dataset. Now instead of query, I'll pick report data provider. And I click on the ellipsis here, and let's find one. I've pre-created one called BI Demo Employee DP. Let's click Next. You can see that it has two fields. So far this looks exactly like what I do when I pick a query. Actually, I want to show you one more thing. Notice that there are no field groups here, right? And there are no table methods here. Now, if I drag the dataset to designs, let's preview. Now I didn't set the style template, so it looks kind of ugly. You can see it just says ID and name, 1 Joe, 2 Chris, 3 Tim. Okay, so that was simple. We consumed a report data provider just like we consumed a query. But let's think about how that was generated in AX, because I told you I use a report data provider, which means that data was constructed via code. So let's take a look at the code. Here's the development environment, and I have a project open. And there are really two pieces you need to pay attention to for these report data providers. The first is you'll need a temp table. And the second is you'll need a class. This is the report data provider class. You can most often see these classes with a name like this that ends in DP for data provider. And before I open the nodes up here and take a look at the code, let's explain how this works. When the report is run, it will call this class to populate the temp table with some data. Once that population is finished, all the data is sent to the AX SSRS server and then rendered. Very simple, right? Let's take a look at the temp table. This is a normal table, right? The reason I call it temp is there's a property here called table type, and I've set it to tempdb. I could have also used in-memory or even regular for these data providers, but the default answer is use tempdb. I just discarded any changes I made. And let's take a look at the fields. These are normal fields. I set the extended data type to both of them. And it's very important you remember to do that, because if you don't, then the entire thing won't work. But that's a standard AX behavior, so I'm sure that won't surprise you. So again, I've got my temp table. This is where the data will be collected before it's sent off to the SSRS framework. So far, so good. Now there's code that generates data in that table, that populates it at runtime. This class, which is called BI demo employee DP, and that's what you saw when I picked it as a data source in my report, has of course a class declaration, this method, which says get BI demo employee temp, and it's just a method that returns some rows, and then process report, which is the thing that populates the temp table. Let's take a look at these one by one. So class declaration, the important part here is to realize it extends this class, SRS report data provider base. That's how we know it's a report data provider. And of course, there's a reference to the temp table here. What about this method? The name isn't so important, but what is important is this attribute. It says SRS report data set attribute, table stir, and it's the name of the table. You can see this is a very simple method. It simply selects from the temp table and returns it. That's it. This is how the R framework retrieves data from the temp table. And finally, the magic is all in this method called process report. And the name of this is important. So process report, in the middle of a TTS begin and TTS commit, simply does anything you want it to do. You can write any bit of code you want. In this case, I've manually inserted records, Joe 1, Chris 2, and Tim 3. And you can see the temp table.insert method calls. That's it. That's the entire report data provider, and this is the simplest example I can give. And when you run the report, again, the temp table is filled via this code, and then our framework will call this method to retrieve the data. And that's it. That is the simplest report data provider class in the simplest hello world scenario I can think of, demonstrating for you a little bit of what we've done with the report programming model. The reason I bring this up is that the report data provider and the programming model, this is what's going to allow you to keep a lot of code you used to have in your MorphX reports and move them forward into the new SSRS framework. This lets you keep a lot of the same code and still use SSRS. Now, it isn't necessarily easy. You can't, simply drop your code there and have everything work, but a lot of it can be preserved. And even going forward, beyond just the theory of conserving your code from the past, any future reporting that does any kind of processing should follow this model. It's the right model as opposed to somehow calling C# data methods that then talk back to AX. This is the way you'll generally write a report in AX that is anything more complicated than a query. Okay, so that's it. That's our third screencast now in AX 2012. And I'm going to halt the AX 2012 screencast for a bit, and we'll go back to AX 2009, because there's still some more topics I need to teach. But if you have any questions or ideas or suggestions for topics for AX 2012 screencasts, please let me know, and we can have the team prepare some. Thanks for your time as always. See you next screencast.